Rome, 65 AD. Emperor Nero kicks his pregnant wife Poppaea Sabina in a fit of rage. She dies within hours, along with their unborn child. But this isn't just another tale of imperial violence. This murder will drive Nero to commit an act so shocking that it defies comprehension. Poppaea wasn't just any empress. She was the most beautiful woman in Rome, a master manipulator who had orchestrated the execution of Nero's first wife to claim the throne for herself. Golden-haired, milk-skinned, and devastatingly intelligent, she had wrapped the most powerful man in the world around her finger. Their love affair began as betrayal. Poppaea was married to Otho, Nero's close friend, when she set her sights on the emperor. She knew exactly how to play him, passionate one moment, distant the next, always keeping him hungry for more. She convinced him to divorce his virtuous first wife Claudia Octavia, then had the poor woman executed on trumped-up adultery charges. For 3 years, Nero and Poppaea ruled Rome together in decadent luxury. While the city burned in the Great Fire of 64 AD, they built the Golden House, a palace so vast it covered a third of Rome, complete with artificial lakes, wild animal preserves, and a 120-foot statue of Nero himself. Romans starved in the ruins while their emperor bathed in milk and dropped flower petals from ivory ceilings. But power changed Poppaea. No longer the careful seductress, she became demanding, challenging Nero's priorities. The final argument came when Nero returned late from chariot racing. Again, Poppaea, heavy with child and exhausted by his neglect, confronted him about abandoning his imperial duties for sport. What happened next shocked even the jaded Roman court. Nero, in a moment of pure rage, delivered a savage kick to his pregnant wife's belly. The blow was fatal. Within hours, both Poppaea and their unborn heir were dead. Nero's grief was immediate and overwhelming. He had killed the one person who understood his grandiose vision of himself. She had seen him not as the monster his subjects feared, but as the artist and performer he believed himself to be. Now she was gone forever, or was she? Nero refused to accept Poppaea's death. He had her body embalmed and placed in Augustus's mausoleum, declared her a goddess, and established a cult in her honor. But conventional mourning wasn't enough for a man with unlimited power and no moral boundaries. For months, Nero would spend hours talking to Poppaea's corpse, having full conversations with her embalmed remains. Servants reported hearing him laugh at her supposed responses, then weep inconsolably when the illusion broke. He commissioned hundreds of statues in her likeness and scattered them throughout Rome. But statues weren't enough. Zephyro needed something alive, something real. So began the most bizarre quest in imperial history, the search for someone who could replace the irreplaceable. First, he ordered agents to scour the empire for women who resembled Poppaea. Same height, same golden hair, same facial features. Dozens were brought to the palace, but none met his impossible standards. How could they? Nero wasn't looking for a new wife. He was looking for his dead wife to return from the grave. Each failure deepened his obsession. If he couldn't find a replacement, perhaps he could create one. He began forcing palace women to dye their hair, change their mannerisms, even undergo primitive cosmetic procedures to match Poppaea's appearance. Still, none satisfied him. Then Nero had a revolutionary idea. What if the perfect replacement wasn't a woman at all? What if it was someone he could completely transform, reshape, recreate according to his exact specifications? That's when his attention turned to the palace slaves, specifically the young men whose delicate features and slight builds might, with the right modifications, approximate feminine beauty. Nero began studying them with the calculating eye of a sculptor examining raw marble. Several young men were selected for Nero's experiments in transformation. They were forced to grow their hair long, wear women's clothing, learn feminine mannerisms. But these half measures didn't satisfy the emperor's vision. He needed something more permanent, more complete. And that's when Sporus entered the story. Sporus was everything Nero was looking for without knowing he was looking for it. A young Greek slave, probably in his early teens, with delicate features that could pass for feminine beauty. smooth skin, large eyes, and that indefinable quality that made people look twice. He worked in the palace kitchens, invisible among hundreds of other servants, until the day Nero noticed him carrying a tray through the dining hall. Something about the boy's profile, the way he moved, the tilt of his head, reminded the emperor of his lost love. Nero ordered Sporus brought to his private chambers. The boy had no idea his life was about to change forever. To him, this was probably just another summons from the notoriously unpredictable emperor, frightening, but hopefully brief. But Nero saw something others missed. With the right modifications, the right training, the right surgical intervention, this boy could become his new Poppaea. Not a replacement, the actual resurrection of his beloved wife in a new body. The transformation began immediately. Sporus was moved from the slave quarters to luxurious rooms near the emperor's chambers. His rough servant's clothing was replaced with fine silk tunics. Palace hairdressers began growing out his hair, styling it to match Poppaea's golden locks. But Nero's vision went far beyond cosmetic changes. He consulted with doctors, surgeons, and experts in what Romans euphemistically called Eastern practices. Because to truly become Poppaea, Sporus would need to sacrifice something that Roman society considered the very essence of masculinity. The emperor had decided that Sporus would be castrated. Castration in ancient Rome was a practice shrouded in taboo and revulsion. Romans associated it with foreign slaves, Eastern eunuchs, and religious cults they considered barbaric. For a Roman citizen to be castrated was unthinkable, but Sporus wasn't a citizen. He was property, and Nero could do whatever he wanted with his property. The procedure itself was brutal by any standard. Without modern anesthesia or surgical techniques, castration was often fatal. Even survivors faced infection, hemorrhaging, and permanent physical and psychological trauma. But Nero had access to the best physicians in the empire, doctors who had experience with the delicate surgery required for his vision. Sporus underwent the operation in a private medical facility within the palace complex. The details are lost to history, but the result was clear. The boy survived, though at a cost that modern minds can barely comprehend. But physical castration was only the beginning of Sporus's transformation. Nero had commissioned an entire team of experts to reshape the boy into his ideal woman. Cosmetic specialists worked on his skin and features. Voice coaches taught him to speak in higher, softer tones. Dance masters trained him in feminine movement and gesture. Sporus received intensive education in being Poppaea. He studied her mannerisms, her favorite phrases, her personal habits. Palace servants who had known the empress were forced to share their memories, helping Sporus perfect his impersonation of the dead woman. The psychological impact on Sporus is impossible to fully comprehend. He had been stripped not just of his physical masculinity, but of his very identity. He was no longer the Greek slave boy from the kitchens, but he wasn't really Poppaea either. He existed in a liminal space between male and female, slave and empress, living person and ghost. Yet Sporus adapted with remarkable resilience. Perhaps he had no choice. Failure to please Nero could mean death. Or perhaps, as some sources suggest, he found unexpected freedom in his new role. As Nero's life, he wielded more power than he ever could have as a kitchen slave. 67 AD, 2 years after Poppaea's death, Nero announced his 69th bride. The Roman elite were curious but not particularly surprised. Emperors remarried regularly, often for political reasons. What they didn't expect was the identity of Nero's chosen partner. When Sporus appeared in public for the first time as Nero's fiancée, the reaction was explosive. Here was a person who looked remarkably like the dead Empress Poppaea, but something was wrong. The voice, the mannerisms, even the facial features were close but not quite right. Rumors began spreading immediately. Some whispered that this was Poppaea herself, somehow returned from the dead. Others suggested it was a long-lost sister or relative. But the most shocking rumor was the truth. But this was actually a castrated male slave, surgically physically and psychologically transformed to replace the emperor's dead wife. Nero didn't care about the gossip. He was convinced his plan had worked.
In Sporus, he had found not just a replacement for Poppaea, but Poppaea herself, reborn in a new body. The emperor's delusion was so complete that he began calling Sporus by his dead wife's name.
The wedding ceremony was lavish beyond imagination. Nero spared no expense in creating a spectacle that would convince Rome and himself that this union was legitimate. Sporus wore Poppaea's jewelry, her ceremonial robes, even her distinctive golden crown. But the most shocking aspect wasn't the luxury, it was the legal framework. Nero officially married Sporus in a ceremony that followed all traditional Roman wedding customs. He gave his bride the legal rights and privileges of an empress. For all practical purposes, a castrated slave had become the most powerful woman in the empire. The wedding feast lasted for days. Nero performed songs he had written about his love for Poppaea Sporus. He showered his new wife with gifts and public displays of affection. To observers, it seemed like the emperor had found happiness again, but beneath the celebration lay a darker truth. Sporus was living a lie so profound that it challenged the very foundations of Roman society, and Nero's grip on reality was slipping further every day. As Nero's life, Sporus enjoyed privileges no slave could have imagined. He wore the finest clothes, ate the most exotic foods, lived in luxury that rivaled the gods themselves. But he also carried a burden that would have crushed a weaker person. He had to be Poppaea Sabina every moment of every day. The psychological demands were enormous. Sporus couldn't relax, couldn't be himself, couldn't even remember who he had been before his transformation. He was trapped in a performance that never ended, playing a role written by a madman who refused to accept reality. Yet somehow, Sporus thrived in this impossible situation. Ancient sources describe him as intelligent, articulate, and surprisingly influential. He seemed to understand that his survival depended not just on physical resemblance to Poppaea, but on capturing her personality and political acumen. Gradually, Sporus began wielding real power. He influenced Nero's decisions, shaped imperial policy, and even interceded on behalf of those who sought the emperor's mercy. In some ways, he became more effective than Poppaea had ever been, because his entire existence depended on keeping Nero happy and stable. But the Roman people remained deeply disturbed by their friend's empress. Traditional Romans saw Sporus as an abomination, a violation of natural law and social order. The idea that a castrated male slave could hold the position of imperial consort challenged everything they believed about gender, power, and propriety. Some senators began plotting against Nero, using his relationship with Sporus as evidence of his unfitness to rule. They argued that an emperor who would marry a eunuch had clearly lost his mind and needed to be removed for the good of Rome. Meanwhile, Nero's delusion deepened. He became increasingly convinced that Sporus actually was Poppaea, somehow restored to him by the gods. He would have long conversations about shared memories that only existed in his imagination, creating a fantasy world where his guilt over Poppaea's murder could be erased. Sporus played along with these delusions because his life depended on it. But the psychological toll was enormous. He was forced to inhabit the identity of a dead woman while suppressing any trace of his original self. The person he had been before his transformation was effectively murdered, replaced by an elaborate fiction. By 68 AD, Nero's relationship with Sporus had become a symbol of everything wrong with his reign. Roman armies were rebelling in the provinces, the Senate was plotting his overthrow, and the people had lost all respect for their emperor. The sight of Nero parading around with his castrated wife convinced many Romans that their leader was completely insane. The end came swiftly. In June 68 AD, facing certain defeat and capture by his enemies, Nero chose suicide over the humiliation of being paraded through Rome as a prisoner. His last words were reportedly, "What an artist perishes in me." Still convinced that history would remember him as a great performer rather than a tyrant. But what happened to Sporus? His fate after Nero's death reveals just how precarious his position had always been. Without his imperial protector, Sporus was suddenly vulnerable to those who had always seen him as an abomination. The new emperor, Galba, initially spared Sporus's life, but forced him to participate in gladiatorial games as entertainment for the Roman mob. The people who had once bowed to him as empress now cheered as he fought for his life in the arena. Sporus survived the games, but faced an even worse fate under Galba's successor, Otho, ironically, the same man who had been Poppaea's first husband before she left him for Nero. Otho wanted Sporus to continue playing the role of his former wife, essentially forcing him to become his own replacement. Rather than endure this ultimate humiliation, Sporus chose death. He committed suicide rather than continue living as someone else's fantasy. His death marked the end of one of history's strangest and most tragic stories. The story of Nero and Sporus reveals the darkest aspects of absolute power. It shows how unchecked authority can warp love into obsession, grief into madness, and human beings into objects to be reshaped according to another's desires. Sporus paid the ultimate price for catching the attention of a man who refused to accept that some things, death, loss, the past itself, cannot be undone. In the end, Nero's attempt to resurrect his dead wife through Sporus failed completely. He couldn't bring back Poppaea, couldn't escape his guilt, and couldn't create the perfect love he imagined. Instead, he destroyed two lives, his own and that of an innocent boy who had the misfortune to remind him of what he had lost. The Roman Empire survived Nero's madness, but the memory of Sporus lingered as a warning about the dangers of unlimited power and unchecked obsession. His story stands as a testament to human resilience in the face of unimaginable trauma, and as a reminder that even the most powerful people in history were capable of acts that defy comprehension. Today, nearly 2,000 years later, we still struggle to understand how such things were possible. But perhaps that's the most important lesson of all, that the capacity for both cruelty and survival exists in every human heart, waiting to be revealed by circumstance and choice.